Well, hey there, and welcome to Understanding the Bible. We're asking today, when is Christ returning? And we're looking at Revelation 20. And so far, we've been using a method of studying this book that looks at what are four different views of interpreting Revelation. Those have been the historicist view, the preterist view, the futurist view, and the idealist view. But those views don't work as we move into Revelation 20 because people from all four of those views have different ways of interpreting that no longer line up with that system. Instead, we're going to be looking at three new terms, new interpretive ways, and these will probably be pretty familiar to you: premillennial, amillennial, and postmillennial. And there's a lot of debate when talking about eschatology or the return of Christ, the end times, between these three positions. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down what each position is, how they interpret Revelation 20. But first, let's ask, why do we need to even use these different views? The reason is because Revelation 20 includes a very specific description of the millennium, of the 1,000-year reign of Christ here on earth. And there is not a commonality in these four views about what that means. Instead, there are three main interpretations, and those kind of mix between the different views. And so that's why we need to focus on this, and the four views no longer works. But this is asking a very different question, and this has been helpful for me to understand actually what these views are, because I find the language kind of confusing between postmillennial, amillennial, premillennial, like what exactly it's talking about. And so here's the distinction. Those four views, the classicist view, preterist view, the futurist view, and the idealist view, they're answering one question. That question is, how do we interpret Revelation? And so the answer would be one of those things. So if you were to interpret Revelation as describing first century events, that it was going to be a tribulation for Christians in the first century, you would be a preterist. That's the way you are reading Revelation. So that word is an answer to the question, how do you read Revelation? As we move to the millennium, you might think it would be, how do we interpret the millennium? I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? But that's not really what the question is answering. The question is, when will Christ return? So once you realize that that's what's being answered, it's kind of like Jeopardy, you got to know that. When you realize what's being answered, these terms make a lot more sense. So if you're asking the question, when will Christ return, and you look at Revelation 20, how do you answer that question? Is he going to return before the millennium, premillennial? Is he going to return after the millennium, postmillennial? Or is the millennium not going to tell you anything about Christ's return, amillennial? And so once you understand the question being asked, this makes a lot more sense. Let's go ahead and dive into the premillennial approach and see what it's saying. This view is holding that Christ will return before the millennium. So when will Christ return? He's going to return before the period of 1,000 years described here in Revelation 20. This view is interpreting Revelation as being fundamentally chronological here. So some readers, they have a very literalistic view of Revelation. This is particularly true in the futurist, but it could be true in other approaches as well. And the default is that unless there's some strong reason to think otherwise, everything in Revelation is being described literally and chronologically. That you just read it and what it says, that's how you interpret it. This view is going to naturally come to this premillennial view. The reason is because this is how Revelation is written. Chronologically, you have Christ's return and reign. That's what's being described here in clear language. If it's not being symbolic, it's definitely a premillennial view. Even someone who sees a lot of symbolism and who does not see a strict chronology in Revelation could still hold this view. So they could interpret other parts of Revelation as not being in a chronological order, but say, in this part, the best interpretation is that it is. And so if you reach the interpretation that what we're seeing here in Revelation 20 is a description of chronology, and that Christ's return and reign on earth is talking about a real return and reign, then what you've got is a premillennial interpretation of Revelation 20. When will Christ return? Before his reign of 1,000 years. In the premillennial view, Revelation ends up looking something like this. The first section of Revelation, chapters 1 through 18, they talk about the tribulation, they talk about all of that, and it could be in a lot of different ways. So for a preterist, they would see this as describing events which occurred in first century. For a futurist, it would be events that are coming up in the future. For somebody following a model more similar to a historicist, they could be events that are happening at some point in history. But whatever the case, those events are describing tribulation and then a coming judgment for that. But when you get to 19, a premillennial view would be that this is describing Christ's return to earth in chapter 19, verse 11, and then his reign in the millennium, the 1,000 years, in chapter 20. With this view, the 1,000 years is typically seen as a literal period of 1,000 years in which Christ will reign on earth from Jerusalem with his people, particularly the martyrs who have died and then have been raised back to life. This time will come to its climax at the end of 1,000 years with Satan being unleashed, and then a final judgment, and lastly, the creation of new heaven and new earth. And that is the premillennial view. The next view is the amillennial view. And this view is that when answering the question, when will Christ return? The millennium is not telling us anything about this. I've really struggled to articulate the difference between the amillennial view and the postmillennial view. They have so much in common, they seem indistinguishable to me. And I think this is the key component. The difference is not so much the sequence of events or what's happening, but it's saying that if we want to know when Christ will return, we can't look to Revelation 20 to give us an answer based on the millennium. So maybe everything's going to play out in a similar way to some postmillennial views, but in answering this question, when will Christ return? Don't even look here. Look somewhere else. That is the amillennial approach. Now, this view is not denying the millennium. That's another piece that's confusing about this language. The idea that the amillennials are opposed to or don't believe in the millennium is part of the name, right? Because it sounds like they're opposed to this idea of millennium. But they accept the millennium as a concept, and they see it as a symbolic one, just one that doesn't answer that question of when Christ will return. And so this view holds that there is no literal millennium. This passage is seen as symbolic instead. There's a lot of overlap with the postmillennial view on interpreting it and what it means. But basically, the idea is that the 1,000 years being described here is symbolic of Christ's reign on earth in the time that we're living right now. Like you see with John the Baptist, the kingdom of heaven is near. Well, with Jesus Christ, with his birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection, the kingdom of God has been unleashed. This is fundamentally talking in Revelation 20 about something which has already happened, and that's that God's kingdom and reign is with us. And it's not a description of a chronology of Christ's return. It's rather just a reality to accept about Christ's reign and authority, that Satan is bound and he's does not have unlimited authority, right? And so it's a description of these type of things rather than of chronological events. Following this, there will be a general resurrection and judgment of evil and good, which will occur at Christ's second coming. So that's the idea. There is a future coming of Christ. It will happen in the future, but it's not tied into kind of interpreting when this millennium is. So that's the amillennial approach, and very similar to it is the postmillennial approach. This view answers the question, when will Christ return? By saying he will return following his millennial reign. He will return after the 1,000-year reign of Christ here on earth. And so this can be pretty similar to the amillennial approach in how it plays out. It could be saying almost the same exact thing, right? That at the death and resurrection of Christ, this reign was unleashed on earth. Like Satan was bound at that moment. It could be that, or it could be something different. And so I think there's two main ways of viewing this postmillennial approach. And both of these kind of line up to the methods used in the previous two views. So similar to the futurist view or similar to the amillennial view. So in relation to the amillennial view, there is a similar interpretation that sees this kind of post-millennial view that we are living in the millennium, that this is a symbolic time period, so it's not representative of 1,000 literal years, but it's just a period that means a long period of time. And we're living through it. We're living through the reign of Christ right now, and that this is a sign or an indication about Christ's future return, right? That we're living through the time described in Revelation 20, and that because of that, we know Christ will return after this. And that's what really distinguishes it from the amillennial view. Alternatively, there are some interpreters of the postmillennial view that I think have a more similar method to the premillennial view, and that's to be more literal with the language. So they see possibly an actual 1,000 years being described. They just see this as being before the return of Christ. So this could be an event which happened in the past but has not been over 1,000 years ago, or an upcoming event, but it's going to be some type of event that unleashes a 1,000-year reign on earth before the return of Christ. So this is, like I said, similar to the premillennial view, but here's the big difference. In this view, Christ is not returning in a physical, literal way. So both of them are reading this fairly literally as far as the 1,000 years and as far as the reign, but not regarding whether Christ is returning. So it could be seen as Christ reigning in a more symbolic way that we might be describing about Christ reigning here on earth, with the actual return of Christ in Revelation 21 as the new heavens and earth are made in the final judgment. One thing that has sometimes marked the postmillennial view is its positivity and its optimistic look at Christ's reign here on earth. The idea is that the world is becoming more and more filled with Christ followers, with Christians, and that God is more and more reigning here on earth. So it's saying, yeah, 2,000 years ago, Christ was reigning and was going into the world with the Great Commission, and we're seeing that his reign is growing and growing. That type of optimism. All right, well, there you go. You have 3 different views of how to interpret Revelation 20 and how to answer the question, when will Christ return? So hopefully that makes more sense. You can kind of understand what people are talking about, and you can like kind of get the nuance of the different positions, and then look at the Bible for yourself and see which one do I think is most accurate, which of these is a good tool to use for interpreting Revelation, or what are the relative merits of each position. So I hope that's helpful, and we're going to be continuing and wrapping up Revelation next week, and it'll be the final week of this study as we wrap up with the new heavens and new earth.